I've become deeply, deeply cynical about the load-bearing institutional beams of the Western world. I have no doubt that the value system that allows someone to stand in opposition to injustice is alive and well. I just don't trust the power centers.
But you are sort of, in this conversation, sort of deliberately not condemning, it seems, what Hamas did.
I can't help but think that even if 90% of this book was condemnation of Hamas, the final 10% that didn't would still cause me to be in a position where I'm sitting here being asked about condemning Hamas and not condemning Hamas enough, which in turn leads me to believe that what I'm really doing that's offensive is not having too little concern for Israeli suffering. It's having any concern for Palestinian suffering at all.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy. This is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is a Canadian-Egyptian writer called Omar El Akkad, and he's written a book called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. It is essentially motivated by watching the unfolding of the killing in Gaza that has followed October the 7th, and his reaction to that, his feelings about that, his feelings about how Western nations, Western liberal democracies, and people who feel that they uphold all the traditions of that have reacted to the war, the killing, and have largely allowed it to happen or looked the other way. And it weaves his reactions to the Gaza war with his own experience and the experience of his family moving from Egypt to Canada via Qatar, and his new reflections on what happened to them in the light of how he now feels, which is quite dislocated from the society in which he lives and which he calls home. Omar, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
It's my pleasure. This
is a remarkable book, coming when it is. And it feels a little bit like a sort of a howl of rage. How did it come about?
In early November of 2023, my editor was in town in Portland, and we were out to dinner, and I was raving and ranting about how I didn't understand what my relationship was to the West anymore in light of the slaughter in Gaza. And I think he might have gotten so sick of hearing me do this. A few days later, he called up and said, "You should write about it." And I had already sort of started sketching it out because writing is my avenue of first retreat. And so I was trying to make sense of it on the page. But what happened was that then for months on end, it was the only thing I was able to write about. And eventually I had a draft of a manuscript. I sent it off to him, and it became a book. And the moment it became a book, I started rewriting it, but it came from this moment where I was so overcome with this kind of rage that I didn't know what to do with myself. And since the only thing I know how to do is write, I started writing.
Now, it is also the story. It's not just the story of how the West sees, reports, explains, justifies the Gaza killing. It's also about the stories of your life, your professional life and your personal life, your story as an immigrant, your parents. But it feels as though this has made you see all of those things also in a different light.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think the reason I sound the way I do, the reason I'm culturally fluent in the culture that I am fluent in is all because I have oriented myself towards the West since I was about 5 years old. And to be in this position where the things I told myself about the bedrock of the society, and I'm talking about the institutional bedrock, political, cultural, academic, journalistic, to see that sort of feel like it's coming apart has led me to a place where I feel like I'm turning away from something that I was oriented in the direction of for a very long time, but I don't know what I'm turning towards.
I mean, just explain that a little bit for people. You know, what the immigrant mindset, if you like, was. Coming originally from Egypt, but then via other countries to Canada, which was what, sort of a beacon of freedom, of democracy, of tolerance, of all of those things?
I think it was a negative space. When you grow up in the part of the world that I grew up in, and you look towards this part of the world, it's not so much what it is as what it isn't. Here's what's not going to happen to me if I talk about Dear Leader the wrong way. Here is the entire enterprise of censorship that's not going to make sure that every newspaper and magazine I get is blacked out. And so in a sense, I had always thought of it as this place where so many of the headaches that I had sort of grown up with weren't going to be a factor. And maybe a lot of that is still true. I don't doubt that at all. But when every morning you wake up and you are watching evidence of some atrocity, some killing, something horrendous, the worst things human beings can do to one another, and you are being told by the press secretaries of the most powerful people on earth that this is good and necessary and needs to continue, and that your tax dollars should keep paying for it, it's very difficult to maintain the same conception of the place and your place within it in that kind of context. And I think that's a lot of what the book is about.
But do you think these values that Western liberal democracies tell themselves that we have, which are liberal, tolerant, democratic, freedom-loving, all those sorts of things, are you saying these things are falling apart, or that they never really existed? That it was a front for something else?
I have no doubt that on a day-to-day level, they exist in every practical sense. What the last year and a half has sort of shown me is that when push comes to shove, they're not nearly as load-bearing as I thought they were. So we have, at least in where I live, all kinds of statements about the importance of international law and norms and what constitutes a war crime. And then you see these things put to the test in a very specific circumstance, and suddenly it's as though they don't exist. When Russia bombs a hospital, that Russia bombs that hospital. Hospitals in Gaza spontaneously combust. After a certain amount of that, it's very difficult to not think in terms of a disconnect between the performative nature of espoused values and the practical reality. And sometimes those things might overlap, I'm sure. But for the last year and a half, it's been very, very difficult to not see a chasm between them.
So just explain how this has happened. I mean, when you say you wake up every morning seeing the worst things, is that on social media? Is that because it's not necessarily on breakfast television?
No, God, no. In fact, the opposite is true. I was talking to a friend about this actually, and his reaction was as though I was talking about something that existed on another planet. I mean, if you live, I don't know what it's like here, but if you live in the US, essentially, if you subscribe to the fat middle of the culture and you watch those news reports on the major networks, it is a different universe than the sort of thing you're seeing live streamed essentially on your social media accounts. So the stakes are distinctly high because depending on what stream you're accessing, what stream of information, you might be completely oblivious to the day-to-day reality of something like this.
So what have you been waking up to for the last year and a half?
I've been waking up to a 6-year-old girl begging for help before having her car shot 355 times. I've been waking up to images of another little girl blown out the window of her bedroom, her limbs missing, hanging from the side of a wall. I've been waking up to what it looks like when little kids starve to death. This has been commonly referred to now as the first live stream genocide. I don't know what that means. I don't know if this is what the future looks like now, the future of atrocity and the reporting of atrocity. All I know is that over the last year and a half, I've become conditioned to knowing that if I see a picture of a smiling Palestinian child on my social media feed, it's probably because that child has just been killed.
Was there a point at which you decided this is how you feel, or you realized this is how you feel, or that you decided, I'm watching a genocide here? I mean, this has been going on for a year and a half. At what point did you decide you knew what was happening?
It was early October of 2023. No, very early on, I had the sense that this was going to be not just a war not just a conflict between a non-state actor and a state actor, that this was going to open the door for a much wider act of eradication. And when I say these things, there's no gloating facet to it, right? You want desperately to be wrong. But early on in October, I had the sense that what we were seeing was the start of a campaign that was going to be of truly stunning and horrific magnitude.
How important is it to you that it is called a genocide, which is what you called it very early on?
Again, this comes back to the notion of what our obligations are to one another. You know, and this question you're asking has been the subject of almost all of the debates I've had with my former colleagues, with the institutions that have asked me to write op-eds, for example. You know, I had a newspaper ask me to write an op-ed about this, and I said, listen, I'm going to save you some time. You're probably not going to run this because I'm going to call it a genocide and I'm going to say that Western governments are complicit. And the editor wrote back and said, yeah, you're right. Weirdly enough, a few months later, I was asked by the same publication to write, and they knew what I was going to do, and that ran. So what has changed, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe enough people have died. But to me, I think I'm not on a particular team that wants to use a terminology. There's an obligation to prevent atrocity that is very much related to the terminology of genocide. And when you have repeatedly evidence that a population is being eradicated, and you keep veering away from that term so as to not offend, you have created the conditions where the term is going to mean nothing eventually. I know that we're having this conversation and it's going to piss off a lot of people. I get that. But I have a very hard time believing that that word holds any weight in terms of the international obligation to prevent atrocity if we have this happening right now and we can't label it that. But that's where I stand, and I'm sure a lot of people stand very, very far away from it.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of problems, aren't there, with the whole question of genocide? Because, you know, some people might say, and this is a tasteless conversation, but if Israel really wanted to eradicate the Palestinian population, it could have killed a lot more. It has nuclear weapons. It could, you know, 50, 60,000 maybe, say that's the number of people who are dead, once you add those who are under the rubble and undiscovered, is a relatively small fraction of a population of millions. So is it genocide? You know, is the intention to destroy the population? Does that matter?
I'm trying to think of how long you can hold on to that argument. If there's a single family left, I mean, presumably they could have been wiped out, but they weren't, right? Like at some point, you start to look at the other side of the spectrum you're describing. Instead of how far away you are from a certain point, how much you're getting closer to that point. We have no idea how many people are dead. We have no idea how many people are under the rubble. The intent to target an entire population. And again, don't listen to me. There is a station in the Arab world that every night will just broadcast Israeli television. You'll just broadcast it unedited so that people can just see what is being said domestically. If the things that have been said do not constitute an intent to target an entire population, then again, I have a very hard time understanding what that term means. Because now we're sitting around knowing that, yes, Israel has the ability to nuke this entire region, and we are essentially sitting around waiting for that before we can use this word. That, to me, strikes me as an incredibly morally diseased place to be. But I'm sure people will make the argument that you've just made of, no, they could have killed a lot more, therefore it's not genocide. And if that's your threshold, then I'm not sure I'm going to be able to convince you of anything different.
And what about the actions of Hamas? Was that an attempted genocide?
It's fascinating to me that we talk about Hamas as this entity that is brought about as a kind of self-contained thing, independent of the history and context of this place. There is nothing I want more than a future in which Hamas doesn't exist, because then it will mean that an ongoing occupation and decades of humiliation and apartheid will have come to an end. I struggle mightily with this notion that you must want for people to suffer of some kind. That the only two options are for somebody to wear the boot or have their neck stepped on. I cannot imagine any kind of act of recruitment for Hamas that would be more successful than what has happened over the last year and a half. All of these people who lost their kids, all of these people who are orphaned, who are going to grow up now in the ruins of their homes. Hamas is this organization that to me anyway, only survives because of a complete vacuum of concern for Palestinian rights or for any kind of concern for Palestinians. The day that anything else exists, I think will do far more damage to a group like Hamas than what has happened over the last year and a half, in which predominantly tens of thousands of civilians have been killed.
Yeah, I mean, and that's been the same before as well. I remember being there the last time in Gaza and going to visit children in, schools who'd lost their parents, thinking, well, what's going to happen to them in 10 years' time? And they were then the generation of this war. But don't you have to have the same moral clarity about that you have about Israel's actions?
One would hope, and one would hope that measure of moral clarity would take into consideration the situation as it stands for Palestinians and Israelis, which is to say, a group of human beings who have been put in an open-air prison for decades on end, and a nation state that is supported by the most powerful nation to have ever existed. Again, I keep coming back to this bizarre binary in which advocating for the end of an occupation and advocating for the end of the illegal theft of a people's land is somehow synonymous with supporting mass violence. I'm in no position to tell Palestinians how to resist their occupation. I'm in no position to tell anyone how to resist their occupation. I don't understand how we get to a place where me calling out the systemic humiliation, land theft, and degradation of an entire people suddenly brings us to a place where I am supporting mass murder on some other population. I think that binary just always strikes me as very bizarre.
Is that what you're accused of?
I'm not accused of anything because nobody really cares what I think about anything. But I've seen that play out over and over and over again.
Yeah, but I mean, but you are sort of, in this conversation, sort of deliberately not condemning, it seems, what Hamas did in the same terms. And there is a simple clarity for you about what's happened over the last 18 months and what Israel has done day in, day out. And a lot of people will understand that. Isn't it also easy to look at the murder of 1,200 people and say that was straightforwardly genocidal and wrong and morally as bankrupt as anything else that you're prepared to judge?
That is fascinating. That is a fascinating position for a variety of reasons, right? For at least two that come to mind first. I do that in this book. And in fact, it's one of the earliest things I do in this book. And I wonder about that a little bit, right? Because this demand of perpetual condemnation seems to me to be very selectively imposed. And again, comes back to this notion of that I must secretly in my heart be gleeful about a group of people being killed. And on its face, that is nonsense. I mean, you don't have to believe me, but I'm telling you on its face, that is complete nonsense. But I can't help but think that even if 90% of this book was condemnation of Hamas, of October 7th, even if it established that October 7th was the beginning of the narrative and nothing existed before, even if it did all of that, the final 10% that didn't would still cause me to be in a position where I'm sitting here being asked about condemning Hamas and not condemning Hamas enough, which in turn leads me to believe that what I'm really doing that's offensive is not having too little concern for Israeli suffering. It's having any concern for Palestinian suffering at all.
Right. So unpack that bit then. So where does that come from? Is that about power? Is it about racism? Is it about alliances?
I think it's about the narrative of a settler colonial state. I don't think any of this is particularly new. It's very difficult to go back into the narratives of manifest destiny, U.S. expansion through North America and the displacement of indigenous human beings and not find a similar sort of construction of narrative. The narrative begins in such a way that the indigenous population are the ones that are acting. They're the instigator, and someone is forced to respond. And once you've established that, that carries on in perpetuity. And I think we're seeing a variant of the same narrative and have been seeing a variant of that same narrative for decades. That is an expression of power. And it's going to continue until it stops, until the narrative no longer functions, until it no longer has power. But this idea that an indigenous population of an area is going to suddenly agree with that narrative strikes me as patently absurd.
One of the things you refer to a lot in the book is the concern expressed by liberal Western governments for the suffering of the Palestinian people and why that is, I don't know how you would describe it, a joke or whatever the best word would be. I mean, explain what you think is going on there. When the Biden administration were day in, day out saying they were appalled by what was going on for the Palestinian innocent people, and the British government was saying the same thing, while supplying weapons, while giving political support to Israel. What's going on there?
I think that too is an expression of power in the sense that at a certain point, and this is particularly true of where I live in the United States, this binary between two political parties that, in terms of where their funding comes from, in terms of who they answer to, are not that different, end up thinking about the immense power involved in wearing the costume of concern, wearing the costume of liberalism, of progressivism, while continuing with policies that have nothing to do with any of this. I mean, on its face, the idea that the Biden administration is deeply concerned for the suffering of Palestinians is something that it takes a very active effort of self-delusion to sort of believe in. But you can do it. You can do it in large part because your audience barely knows any Palestinians, is wrapped up in a story in which American concern for the downtrodden is a sort of given, and you can kind of get away with it. The problem is that after a certain point, the narrative starts to fall apart. And I think that's sort of what you saw in the lead up to the last election, where you had a candidate for the Democratic Party who saw the polling on Gaza, saw the polling on how many people were demanding a ceasefire, and decided that the best course of action was to send Bill Clinton to Michigan to tell Arabs how necessary it was that their relatives continue getting killed. That, again, is just a chasm. It's a chasm between a performance and a reality. And you can only get away with that for so long.
Because do you think the reality is they don't care?
Yes, I think in this case, you could say something about it, and you could issue a press release, and you could be in that space narratively. But you are sending the bombs that are killing these kids. That is the same administration. That isn't some rogue arm that is doing this. And I think that the difficulty for me is that, I've written this book that looks like it's coming in through the door swinging, right? Like it's throwing punches. I'm not trying to argue with anyone. I think a lot of what's in this book is a reflection of what a lot of folks are feeling now, in the sense of a fundamental alienation from the messaging, because I can't look away from the practical reality. And if I could, I would immediately align myself with the messaging. The messaging sounds great. We want a lasting peace. We believe that the Palestinian people shouldn't suffer. The messaging works in a vacuum. But having been exposed to the reality, it becomes very hard to intertwine those things.
So what has that done for your identity?
It's put me in a deeply uncertain place. I am fluent in Western culture. This is what, since I was 5 years old. And suddenly I feel an immense desire to sort of take leave of that. But what the hell am I turning to? I don't know. I fundamentally don't know. And I've talked to a lot of people, particularly in the US where I live, who are in a similar kind of dilemma, where, they feel that they are much further removed from this place than they might have previously thought they were, but they don't know what their place is anywhere else. And so there's a kind of searching, and there's a kind of sense of deep unease and instability with respect to who you are, when this thing that, in my case, you've attuned yourself to for the better part of 40 years suddenly feels like something you don't want anymore.
Yeah, because some people are going to listen to you and go, well, go home then.
Yeah, go back where you came from.
Go back to Egypt.
Yeah, go back where you came from. Listen, man, I was a journalist for 10 years during the height of the comments section. This stuff isn't new, right? Like, I get it. I absolutely get it. And it's difficult for me to take it seriously, because I don't care. It doesn't, I wrote an op-ed recently, and the comments were exactly what you would expect, but one of the subset of the comments was just people writing my name down. This op-ed is by a guy named Omar El Akkad, and then the subtext was clear, right? That, like, why are we listening to this, right? And I get that.
But what does Egypt represent to you? If someone says, well, why can't you go home if you don't feel comfortable here? How would you feel there?
I would feel deeply uncomfortable because I left when I was 5 because my dad had to get the hell out of the country. One of the really fascinating things about this sort of go back where you came from back and forth, which I'm going to get so many times over the course of this book.
You will after this, yeah.
And I get it, right? Is that it applies to the individual and never the empire. Setting aside all of the things about actually moving, and the fact that as soon as I got to Egypt, as soon as I started speaking Arabic, everybody there would understand in an instant that I hadn't been here in a long time, and just the nature of having lived this kind of life. It's not really an argument that I can mount much of a defense against. It's the easiest counter argument to make to everything in this book. Go back where you came from. You don't like it? Go back where you came from. Fantastic. Could the tentacles of the empire also go back where they came from? Is that part of a package deal, or is it purely when a certain subset of people criticize that they're the ones who have to go back where they came from, that only applies to them?
But is it your feeling or your fear now that there is no such thing really as liberal values, or that they only pertain to, I don't know, home affairs? Literally home affairs.
This is going to sound very, very bizarre given the conversation we've had so far, given the content of this book, but I think of these things in incredibly hopeful terms. Over the last year and a half, I've become deeply, deeply cynical about the load-bearing institutional beams of the Western world, be they political, journalistic, cultural, whatever. But I've had the almost opposite reaction to what people are doing individually. I mean, I've seen immense courage. I've seen immense solidarity. I've seen people risk their lives and livelihood and their careers and their reputations to stand up for a group of human beings who can offer them almost nothing in return. I've leached courage from all of these people. I have no doubt that the value system that allows someone to stand in opposition to injustice is alive and well. I just don't trust the power centers to be the gatekeepers of that. So, in a sense, the things I turn my back on now in the Western world are not particularly linked to what I'm seeing individuals do.
You see, I mean, I couldn't really tell reading this whether this was almost sarcastic or not. When you say one day everyone will have always been against this.
Yeah.
Do you mean that? Do you think they will? Or are you saying, or is that sort of part of the howl?
I am completely convinced that this will be the case. Where I have differed with the people who've read the book is I think a lot of people who've read the book think I'm talking about next week. The US government issued this proclamation a few years back, essentially saying, hey, Indigenous people, really sorry about all the genocide. And they did it quietly. It wasn't a big deal. How many years removed are we from that making any difference at all to the active part of that genocide? I firmly believe that just like you have a hard time finding somebody now who was fully in favor of South African apartheid, I fully believe that sort of shift is coming. I just think a lot of people picked up the book and thought I was talking about like a month and a half from now. And I would love to believe that, but that's not the time frame I'm thinking.
And do you think you feel the way you do because of your immigrant background, or do you think, a white American whose family have been there for generations might also feel the same thing?
From my very limited anecdotal experience, I've seen it across groups of people, that the distinction is most glaring, not along lines of religion or ethnicity or migrant background or ideological belief, conservative, liberal. The biggest distinction I've seen has been generational. When I talk to younger people and the subject of this book comes out, there's not a single sentence in that book that they find anything other than tame and almost quaint. There's a generational divide that I'm seeing that I had not seen before. And that might well have to do with this idea of where you're getting your information from, right? If you're sitting there every day and you're watching this endless stream of atrocity, I think it's very difficult then to A, look away from it, and B, continue believing in a frame of reference in which whatever happens, the society I live in is run by the good guys and everything works out along those lines. So that's been the biggest sort of distinction that I've seen in the last year and a half.
One of the things you take on as well is the role of the media and journalism, being a journalist yourself. And you're critical of the pursuit of a neutrality, if you like, on Israel-Gaza. Just explain your position.
I think the business of journalism entails knowing what things are and searching that truth out. There's a version of this interview that we're doing right now that involves you just picking up this book on the way here and leafing through it as you come to the interview. And there's a version in which you read the whole thing. And both of us know what that looks like, the difference between the kind of interview we have. That's not particularly novel, right? That's the nature of journalism. You go out and you find out things. One of the more difficult things about the last year and a half is watching how that information is presented, particularly in the use of language. There was a presenter talking about an incident in which Israeli soldiers had shot a 4-year-old girl. And I'm trying to parse the language here of something like, the bullet found its way into the van and collided with a 4-year-old young lady. I don't know what the hell a 4-year-old young lady is. I don't know what that linguistic construction is designed to achieve. Whenever I see journalism veer into that space, it seems to be engaged in the exact opposite of what journalism is. It's a blanketing of meaning. It's a suffocation of meaning. And
so a war in which 45,000 people have died as opposed to 45,000 people
in which
were
hospitals
killed.
spontaneously
Yes.
combust and that sort of thing. And it's not the first time you see that, right? Like in the US where I live, quite often bullets collide with black motorists, right? They just sort of find their way into the car. There are officer-involved shootings. There's this sort of entire cottage industry of euphemism that puts a distance between the thing and the description of the thing. But your job as a journalist is to do the exact opposite, is to bridge that distance, right? And so to see it done over and over and over again, I think has caused me to reassess how I think about all journalism, which is a deeply unfair thing because I've worked with journalists for decades, and I trust their work overwhelmingly. But you can't watch this over and over again and not have it shift your entire view of when this industry can be trusted to present the information as it is and when there's going to be some other consideration.
So apart from this sort of passive language, what other things are you talking about?
I'm talking about the first interpretation of an event, and then when it becomes clear after the fact that first interpretation might have been torqued in some way, how much there is an effort to correct that, or to come up with a follow-up story, or to in some way treat the factual aftermath of an event with the same kind of magnitude and the same kind of volume as the initial event. And this, I think, has happened over and over again.
I mean, the example you give in the book is about the Israeli claims about beheaded babies, which was made very early on, I think on October the 7th.
Yeah, 40 beheaded kids, I think, was the initial claim. And look, I mean, I understand that I'm put in this position where there's a sense that I'm like, oh, he's picking this one act here. He's clearly biased in this direction or another.
Well, you'd better sort of flesh it out, because a lot of people still think that's been evidenced and is what happened.
And it's never, a lot of people are never going to change their minds. And a big part of that is that there was one version of that story that shows up on front pages and shows up in glaring headlines, and more important than that, seems to agree with what some people's imagination tells them these people are capable of. And once those things align, that story has a kind of ripple effect that is so much more powerful, because we believe in our heads that those people would do that sort of thing. And so that's your initial one. And then over time, there is a sense of a trickle of information that says, well, no, that's not what happened. It's not the same. There are going to be people who might hear this interview who are like, no, he's lying. That happened. That's a thing that happened. On top of that, you have a situation where foreign journalists can't go into Gaza. And the local journalists who are actually doing the ground level reporting, who are risking their lives and who, for more than 100 of them, have cost them their lives, aren't believed to the same extent.
And the other problem is as well that, as you say, is it's quite difficult to prove that it didn't happen for all the same reasons. And if you're dealing with the kind of crime that people think is plausible, then it's done its job already.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're a much better journalist than I am.
I don't. Well.
The threshold of I can't prove it didn't happen. How often in your line of work is that sufficient?
No, but that's the world we're in, I think, now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because of these claims, these claims that have taken hold in the narrative that a lot of people believe. The Israelis issued images of dead babies. Wasn't clear where from. And so a lot of people do still believe that that happened. And it's quite difficult to say, but it didn't happen because there's no other evidence for it.
And do you want to be the person who denies that that happens and then it turns out that it did?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, and it may well have happened in some cases. You don't know. I mean,
we were sitting here, we're talking about a region that before October 7th, long before October 7th, was an open air prison, and where access was heavily, heavily controlled. And since October 7th has essentially been a no-go zone for foreign journalists to come in. And I wonder a little bit about what journalists are supposed to do in that situation, right? Because, okay, I'm not allowed in. Therefore, I have to be ready to believe anything. I have to be ready to dismiss the reports of the people who are in there because I can't get in there. The playbook of what to do in that kind of situation is, I think, a lot less straightforward because reporters are used to reporting. We go to the place, we find the information, we verify to the best of our ability, we write the report. That playbook is out the door, right? So what do you do? And I know we were sitting here talking about Palestine, but this, I think, is certainly going to apply to the next 4 years of the Trump administration, right? There's going to be a deliberate attempt to create an information environment where the goal is not to get you to believe anything. It's to get you to believe everything at once or nothing or multiple contradictory things. It's to turn the ground to mush. And I think it's not just when we're talking about the slaughter in Gaza. This is going to be across the board. And it's a deeply malicious thing, and it destroys the fabric of a society when it's allowed to fester.
So where does that leave you as a journalist? I mean, if you don't want to do journalism according to the traditional rules and norms that have led us down this route that you think is a disaster, then what do you do?
I think institutionally, I'm no longer particularly interested in that mode of journalism that gives you a claim and gives you a counterclaim, and then leaves it at that because I've done my job now and no one can accuse me of bias. We have lawmakers in the United States who openly muse about whether wildfires are created by secret Jewish space lasers. I can give you that claim and then find somebody to say, no, that's insane, and then leave it at that. And that could be our journalism, right? We could just go along in that mode indefinitely. But I'm not interested in that anymore. I think when you have any entity that is acting in patent bad faith, you can no longer apply the claim, counterclaim, leave it at that model. But I think that's also a very difficult sell for a lot of traditional journalism outlets because for as long as I can remember, that has been the model of neutrality. That's been the model of objectivity. I say the moon is made of cheese. You say it isn't. Here we go. File the story. We're good. That's fine in issues where the stakes aren't particularly high, I suppose.
And it's fine in liberal democracy.
It's sure.
But as governments become more and more extreme, that model becomes more and more challenged.
Yeah. And I think it falls apart a million different ways. And again, it's very easy for me to sit here with you and make these criticisms. I don't have to run a newsroom, right? So I'm cognizant of that.
But do you think that means the news then has to take sides? You'll get a news organization on one side and a news organization on the other, and you take your pick.
The news is always taking sides. Even in the choice of what to cover, the news is taking sides. And the choice of what not to cover, what not to follow up on, what gets on A1 and what gets on A15 in a brief that nobody reads. The news is constantly taking sides. I think the veneer of objectivity, of not taking sides, is a fun thing to have when everything else is working well. But when it's not, yes, you have to take sides. And to be perfectly honest, the side you have to take is the side against the dissemination of bull.
So, I mean, it takes to the wider question of how you resist everything that you are railing against. How you resist in politics, for a start. Can you work within a system? Can you work within a party and resist? Or do you have to go outside?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the book is me struggling with that question, right? And I have a conversation in the book where I'm talking to a friend of mine about, within the context of literature, which is obviously where I operate, these boards and organizations, and me being torn between the idea of staying on these boards and wanting to be in the room versus taking leave of them because I'm disgusted at what they've said and more often what they haven't said, right? And him saying like, yeah, you can stay in the room, but it's still going to be the same room. I think what you're going to see and what you're already seeing is a kind of exodus, particularly by younger folks, from organizations, from entities that appear to not have the backbone to speak out at a moment where many people feel something existential is happening, right? But where do they go? And this is where I think the creation of new networks, new institutions, is really the only way to go. But am I gonna start a new public broadcaster from scratch? I can barely pay the rent. I'm gonna start my new entity that's gonna compete with these. And so I wish I had this incredibly clean answer to give you, but this is what I'm struggling with right now.
It may just be dislocation. That's the danger, isn't it? We have a politician in this country, Murray Black, who got elected very, very young and has left politics sort of rather disaffected. You think about AOC, who you talk about in America in the book, who was very critical of what was going on in Gaza, but ultimately found herself backing Biden. There's a basic problem for those people, isn't there? Do they just give up?
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing is this very bizarre kind of ethical and moral double-jointedness, in the sense that, I can't count the number of times I've had this argument with friends where I will lay out why it has become, at least for me, and I'm not trying to convince anyone else of this, morally impossible to vote for Biden. I don't care who he's running against. I just have a level of absolute horror beyond which I can't align myself with someone, and genocide happens to be that line. And yet, every time the counter argument is, yes, but Trump is going to be worse. And I get that. And I get why people would make that calculus. And maybe it is the case that no number of dead Palestinians are going to affect your day-to-day life, whereas Donald Trump may well do, right? And if that's your personal calculus, fine, do your thing. But if we're in this position where, in the case of the United States, for example, I am expected at every election to open the ballot, find whoever has the R under their name, and then just vote for the person with the D under their name because that's the lesser of two evils, when is that ever not going to be the case? This idea of tethering yourself to being slightly better than the worst possible thing is untenable over time. And I think unless the party responsible is punished for it in some way, there's no reason not to. You will always be able to send out that fundraising email that says, the next election is the existential one. The future of U.S. democracy is dependent on this.
Is that what's happening now?
I mean,
the Democrats have been punished for that? Because people obviously look to this country and they wonder whether Labour will be punished in the same way and give way to some sort of right-wing coalition involving Nigel Farage and
I don't know that in the context of the leadership of that party, the last loss was all that big a deal, in the sense that, well, now you don't have to own any of this mess. So another administration comes in and owns it. But the notion of having to fundamentally change your party to address these concerns that are being yelled at you by a growing number of your electorate, including the new generation that your future is dependent on, is such a bigger undertaking. And so, yes, I would like to think that they were punished. I mean, they lost the White House. They got beaten pretty badly. I just don't know that they see it that way.
Can I take you back to some of the sort of the stories that you tell in the book about your own life and your own family life? How did you end up in Canada, for a start? How did your family end up in Canada?
So if you live in a place like Qatar, where 90% of the population is from somewhere else, only 10% of the population is Qatari, you live on a work permit, sponsorship, essentially. And everybody understands that that's never permanent. That's always sort of precarious. And so anticipating this, my father decided to start the immigration process to Canada. And after we completed it years later, one day the sponsorship wasn't renewed. We had to go somewhere else. And so we ended up migrating to Canada as a result.
One of the things you talk about, though, is what happened to his status. What happens to the migrants' status when they go in that direction, as opposed to the Westerner going the other way?
Yeah, I mean,
explain what happened to your family then when as it moved from Egypt to Canada.
Yeah, I mean, we occupied these lives that were of less agency, and they weren't bad lives. It was just a matter of this trickle of things that you have to learn to live with. So your work credentials aren't worth as much; they're not considered as serious. Your ability to behave with a kind of cultural fluency becomes a real hindrance. And none of this stuff is particularly new. Every migrant will know exactly the kind of stuff I'm talking about. You go order a coffee, someone hears your accent, the cashier hears your accent, and they suddenly start speaking louder as though you're hard of hearing, or that sort of stuff. And that's fine. It's something you learn to live with anyway. It's just very interesting to see when the vector is pointed in that direction versus the other. Like, we have a terminology for this sort of stuff, right? We have an entire spectrum of terminology that is related to the perceived worth of a human being in relation to their migrant status. It starts at alien, illegal, economic migrant, and then as you start going towards the privilege end of the spectrum, so the white Westerners who were living in Qatar, for example, they were clearly economic migrants. They were there for the money. There was no doubt about that. But you don't call them that. You call them expats, right? They're doing the country a favor by being there. And so you become keenly aware of there being this hierarchy, this spectrum of privilege. And it's not so much that this stuff doesn't happen everywhere in the world when people move. It's just a very jarring thing when you are suddenly forced along that spectrum to an entirely different point. It induces a kind of psychological whiplash that I think has been a function, at least of my experience. This isn't a criticism of the places we migrated from or to or anything like that. It's just a description of how it alters your way of being in the world.
What does it take then to get from this state in which the West has tolerated, gone along with, looked the other way, however you want to describe it, when it comes to what's happened in Gaza and the killing there, to a realization? Is it, what is it? Is it just time? Is it perspective? What is it?
A realization of what?
That everyone was always against this. Which you maintain will happen.
I do, and which you seem to think is absolutely not going to happen. Which might be right. Look, man, I can't predict the future. Even though I have a deep sense that I would bet on that anyway. I suspect that when I think about sort of what colonialism is and what the settler colonial state is, I think of a kind of endless taking. And that taking begins with the very real practical things, the taking of land, the taking of resources, the taking of the lives of people who stand in the way. But I think eventually it moves into more abstract things like the taking of narrative, the taking of a people's story, for example. I came of age right around the time of the September 11th attacks and the War on Terror years, essentially. My entire adulthood has sort of overlapped with that. And I remember this sort of stunning silence and this bloodlust. And I remember all of that in the early days. And I also remember the protests, right? There were massive, massive protests. But then one of the really interesting things as the years pass is that alternate narratives become a little more acceptable. but the right people have to tell those stories. What I mean by that is you start to see all of these books being written by former Marines who came back from Iraq and wanted to write about how sad it made them. And you start to see that being the first sort of door opening into the telling of a different story about this very sort of intense, incendiary moment. And I think something similar is going to happen here. I mean, I get that this book, might prove controversial or any of that, but I think over time, if it is remembered, it's going to be remembered as one of the tamest of its kind. I don't think what's coming is going to be nearly as shy as what's in this book.
Is it because you think people already think it's wrong, but aren't prepared to face that reality, or are more prepared to look the other way because, as you say, it's not affecting them on a day-to-day level? Or is it that they haven't realized it yet?
I think it's a little of both. I think certainly the former is true. I think for the vast majority of people living in this part of the world, if you were to choose to look away from this, there's effectively no consequence. There's no real impact on your day-to-day life. But one of the things I try to do, and maybe I don't succeed at all, but one of the things I try to do in this book is sort of tie that into what happens when you start to exercise that muscle of looking away. What happens when you condition yourself to be able to do that? It doesn't stop with a single slaughter. It doesn't stop with a single geography in which something unjust is happening. Once that muscle is developed, it can be exercised along any lines. And I think at some point, it becomes clear that this is going to become the default mode of being in the world, that you're just constantly waking up every day and deciding to look away from more and more wrongdoing, more atrocity, more exploitation. Eventually, that hits a wall. It sort of has to. And once it does, it's no longer sustainable. You have to look at it. And so that's sort of how I think about this. Right now, you have the privilege of compartmentalizing a certain horrible thing, and maybe a next one and a next one and next one, but that always comes to an end. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that human capacity for looking away is actually unlimited.
If you could change the world in any way, wave a magic wand right now, what would you do?
God, that list is so long. It's so long. At the very top, I suppose, transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think a lot of our most distressing issues can be solved or not solved, but not if we render this planet uninhabitable. That would probably be at the top of the list. That is a bit of a cop-out answer, I think, because it allows me to talk about all of us being in this together, and it's one overarching. But of course, this thing is going to be overlaid onto our existing asymmetries and injustices, and of course, the most vulnerable are going to suffer first. But yeah, if you gave me full policy lever control and all of it, that would probably be at the top of the list.
Omar El Akkad, thank you very much indeed.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.